Hi, everybody, and welcome to those in person as well as who are joining us online. I think we're going to get going and others will find us along the way. So welcome, everybody, to today's event on debt and underdevelopment in the Global South. I think it's a topical event. A couple of weeks ago, there was the big FFD conference, Financing for Development, held in Seville, Spain, which was discussing these issues. The report, which our main speaker will be speaking to, came out recently, the Jubilee Report. So we thought it's timely to have an event on these issues, which are not new, but I guess perhaps unfortunately remain relevant. So let me introduce our speakers. First of all, Professor Grieve Chelwa. He's the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and an associate professor of political economy at the Africa Institute Global Studies University in Sharjah. He's a member of the Jubilee Commission on the Debt and Development Crisis in the Global South. This was a commission convened by the late Pope Francis to work on these issues, which we'll be discussing today, of debt and development. Amongst other accolades, he was recognized this year by the Africa Report as one of 10 African scholars to watch in 2025. He holds a PhD in economics from UCT, and he's been based in his career in different institutions, the New School in New York, at UCT, at Harvard, Wits, and so on. Among other affiliations, he's non-resident senior fellow at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and as SARChI Industrial Development, we are also honored to have him affiliated with us as a visiting associate professor. And then we'll be having a second presentation or a response from Kamal Ramburuth, who is based at the IEJ. He was formerly a researcher in debt and development finance, and he's now IEJ's G20 Project Lead. He's worked extensively on the issues of today's event, debt, development finance, and so on. He's been involved for many years in trying to transform economics. He was the co-founder of the Rethinking Economics for Africa chapter and at Wits, and I think more broadly the movement in South Africa. He's also been based at Southern Center for Inequality Studies, UNCTAD, and so on. And he was recently a speaker at the FFD conference in Spain on the topic Feminists Against Debt, Trade, and Financial Injustice. So thank you to both of our speakers. Let me hand over to Grieve, who will be speaking to the Jubilee report, which has come out recently. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Professor Tregena, for that generous introduction. It's very nice to be back in Johannesburg. I first arrived in Johannesburg in 2007, and I always like to come back here. I forgot how chilly Johannesburg can be, so I got a shock of my life yesterday. And thanks to Kamal, my good comrade, for accepting to join me in this party. Yes, so I'd like to talk a little bit about this Jubilee report. And the way I want to talk about it is sort of follow this type of outline. Part one, talk about the Africa debt situation, just the debt situation in its numbers. Part two, talk a little bit about Zambia as a case study, which is a country I'm from, a country I know better, but also a country that has been referred to as ground zero of the debt crisis. And then talk about some of the proposals from the Jubilee report and try to think about those proposals in trying to answer the questions, do those proposals resolve the Zambian debt crisis and by extension the debt crisis in Africa and in the Global South. So let's talk about the Africa debt situation because this is where we are now. So as that figure shows, and UNCTAD has done some of the most fascinating work in trying to assemble numbers and details about the debt story. So I take all this from UNCTAD's website. So you can see really, in general, the African debt story is a blue line there. So debt is growing everywhere. This chart shows you some of the countries with the biggest levels of debt in absolute numbers. So Egypt, about $420 billion. South Africa, where we are here, $288 billion. Nigeria, Algeria, Morocco, and so on and so forth. And all that makes up $1.8 trillion of debt. And that debt is domestic. Some of it is domestic, some of it is external. I argue the problematic one is always the external one, because you have some degree of control over the domestic one. And I haven't looked at South Africa's numbers, but I suspect South Africa's story might be more rand-denominated debt as opposed to US dollar-denominated debt, which is the reverse in the case of Zambia. So this chart shows you the number of countries with high debt levels, and you see the spike. So it's developing countries above, Africa down, and you see the spike when COVID hits in 2020. When I talk about the Zambian case study, I will make the argument that the predominant driver of debt in Africa and the global south is external shocks, which goes counter to how the IMF and how most people in the global north think about debt in the global south, right? They think about it as something we did to ourselves. We were careless, much like how we think about the poor, right? The poor person is indebted. We like to think, why are they in debt? As opposed to thinking, what are the external circumstances that got them into debt? So this chart does show you the story. You see, the number of countries in Africa that are indebted sort of rise with COVID. This chart tells you the number of countries with interest expenditures exceeding 10% of revenues, right? So you can see in Africa, the blue line, it's also trending upwards, which is not great. If you are spending chunks of your tax revenues on interest payments, that's not good for development down the line. This chart, which is one of the most, which is smoking gun chart that shows you just how bad things are, it tells you exposure to external shocks. So the dotted yellow line at the top there is telling you external public debt as a share of exports, right? Because this is important, because often we settle external debts through export receipts, because external debts are in US dollars. So we need to generate US dollars to pay those debts, right? So it's important to think about what percentage of our debts are sort of, what's the relationship between external debts and share of exports. So you can see there, 140%, right? Somewhere there, 140% is the median level of external debt as a share of exports. So external debt is multiple and a half of exports. That's also not good. This is telling us what's been happening in terms of interest payments in Africa over 2 time periods. So the change in expenditure on different particular items. So expenditure on net interest, education, health, investment. So you can see there that in Africa between 2010 and now, expenditure on net interest, servicing debt, has gone up by 132%, right? Whereas expenditure on education has gone down by 3%. Expenditure on health has only gone up by 6%. Expenditure in investment has only gone up by 7%. So if you're thinking about development down the line, this is telling you that we're really doing an injustice to future generations, right? We're spending much more on net interest payments than we are on things that are good investments in our people and in the future, education, health, investment, and so on and so forth. And then the yellow bars are in the rest of the developing world. So they're doing badly, but not as badly as we are doing in Africa. And then this is just a chart that tells you countries where interest payments outweigh development spending. And development spending are seen as education, health, investment. So there's some flags there. You can recognize your own country. South Africa, interest payments are outweighing expenditure on investment. Zambia shows up on health, it shows up on education. So we really have a crisis, right? We do have a crisis. Okay, I think, let me go into the Zambia case study. So I really set it up now to show you that we really do have a debt crisis. I've sort of shown the metrics of how one can think about a crisis. And I want to talk a little bit about the Zambia story, which is a Zambia case study. And if you allow me, if I beg your indulgence, I'll read from what I've written up here. So what I'm going to read now is based on a paper that I published a couple of months back. It's called External Forces and Zambia's Permanent Debt Crisis. The main thrust of the paper, which I'll cover in a second, is really making the argument that debt dynamics in Zambia, and by extension in much of Africa, and by extension in much of the global south, are really driven by external factors. And that's important when you come to think about the solutions that often come from the IMF. The IMF emphasizes austerity, which is an internalist argument, right? Okay, so let's start. So many developing countries are presently in the throes of yet another sovereign debt crisis that threatens to derail their development aspirations. Especially concerning is the size of developing country public debt that is owed to external creditors, which UNCTAD estimates was 3.2 trillion at the end of 2023. Unlike domestic public debt that is owed in local currency, external public debt is especially pernicious, given that its settlement relies on external factors that developing countries have little control over. For instance, a major source of foreign currency to service external debts are export receipts that are often linked to the export of primary commodities. An old and extensive literature has shown that the prices of primary commodities on the global markets fluctuate in such a way that debt crises can easily be generated in developing countries. Also, given the importance of debt in determining economic fortunes, there's a long and extensive literature that considers the determinants of external debt accumulation in developing countries, especially in Africa, where, as mentioned before, its negative effects are most salient. This literature can be broadly classified into two camps. One camp emphasizes internal factors, a second camp advances external factors. Studies in the internal camp, what I call the internalists, have identified a set of internally determined factors as key to influencing debt dynamics, the standard stuff that you learn in a macro class: savings, investment, fiscal deficit, trade deficit, unemployment, and so on and so forth. Consequently, the internalists view the worsening of the aforementioned factors as key in increasing external debt. Crucially, and given that these factors are internal to African countries, the internalist camp, by implications, lay the blame for dangerous external debt acquisition squarely at the feet of African countries. The external camp, the externalists, tend to view external debt as largely determined by factors beyond the control of African countries and linked to the continent's structural relationship within the world system. The classic study in the externalist tradition is a timeless study by Mkandawire and Soludo from 1999, titled Our Continent, Our Future, whose careful analysis of Africa's first sovereign debt crisis in the 80s saw that crisis as emerging out of an unfavorable external environment. According to Mkandawire and Soludo, the run-up to the 80s were characterized by two oil price shocks that consequently precipitated a recession in the advanced countries that in turn affected the demand and prices of export commodities that are the mainstay of African countries. On the other hand, the oil price shocks led to inflation in advanced countries whose cure, the steep raising of interest rates via the so-called VOCA shock, further worsened the balance of payments position of African countries. Other work in this tradition includes the study by Follet, who locates Africa's external debt problem within a framework of declining terms of trade in the longue durée, and the influential work by Boyce and Nkumana on the link between external debt and capital flight. Okay, so unlike the literature on internal drivers of debt, the externalist literature is relatively small and focuses on cross-country analysis with little by way of detailed country case studies. Further, the externalist literature has not had an impact on policy discussions around the management of external debt in Africa. For example, the bedrock of current policy prescriptions for resolving the current debt crisis continue to emphasize austerity, which is an internalist argument, and as I argue later, may actually lead to more debt crises in the future. Zambia presents an interesting case study to study the drivers of external debt dynamics. As Figure 1 illustrates, with the exception of two very brief periods in the 60s, so Figure 1 is here. As Figure 1 illustrates, with the exception of two very brief periods in the 60s and 2000s, when the stock of external debt was either flat or declining, Zambia appears to always be in a perpetual state of dangerously accelerating external debt levels, which have ultimately resulted in crisis. That is, the country appears to always be in a permanent state of debt. Interestingly, these periods of debt acceleration have coincided with instances when internalist factors have either been improving or worsening, a fact suggesting that forces external to Zambia must be influencing the country's debt dynamics. My talk takes this possibility seriously by investigating the extent to which external factors might be influencing external debt acquisition in Zambia. Specifically, we consider the role played by three factors. So the first external factor I look at is the international price of copper. The second external factor I look at is International Monetary Fund imposed conditionality on fiscal constraints. And the third factor I look at is US monetary policy. We argue that these three forces have at various times conspired in influencing debt dynamics in Zambia. That is, explain debt buildups and debt crisis. I believe that a better understanding of the dominant influences of Zambia's debt will allow for a richer conversation of strategies to prevent it in the future. So let me start with the first factor that I believe drives debt in Zambia. That's copper. So the role of copper and debt in Zambia. The story of Zambia is a story of copper. Copper's role in shaping the Zambian economy is especially seen in the numbers. According to the Bank of Zambia, copper earnings make up 71% of foreign exchange earnings and make up a sizable percentage of its economy. The importance of copper to Zambia is also understood in the role it has historically played in the acquisition of debt. Periods in which copper exports have been high have led to periods of dangerous debt buildup, which in turn have subsequently led to crisis. In other words, there's a sense in which the Zambian state has expected the good times to continue ad infinitum and therefore taken out loans under the assumption that they'll be able to pay them back out of ever higher copper export receipts, only for those earnings to decline shortly thereafter. Figure 4 shows the historic relationship between external debt and copper export earnings from 1960 to 2023. We see in the figure that between 1960 and 1970, copper export earnings dwarfed external debt, setting the scene for the dangerous accumulation of debt in Zambia and Zambia's first debt crisis that was only resolved in 2005 with the attainment of the HIPI completion point. After attaining the HIPI completion point, copper export earnings yet again dwarfed the stock of external debt, setting the scene for yet another dangerous accumulation of debt in subsequent periods, ultimately leading to the current crisis, which is the second debt crisis. It is worth pointing out that decisions to begin accumulating debt on the back of high copper export earnings have been reasonable. For example, in the 1970, the Zambian government decided to issue dollar-denominated bonds equal to $2 billion in present-day terms that were meant to finance the purchase of majority stakes in Zambia's mines that at the time were foreign-owned. Unfortunately, these bonds were backed by copper receipts, and the subsequent underperformance of copper on international markets sowed the seeds for Zambia's first debt crisis. The current crisis, as I expand shortly, was a result of the need to borrow to plug an infrastructure deficit following many years of neglect owing to externally imposed fiscal constraints by the IMF. A natural question arises: why did Zambia not accumulate enough savings in the good times in order to avoid borrowing altogether? For example, the information in Figure 4 shows that from 1960 to 1969, copper export earnings totaled $7 billion, a number greater than the $6 billion that was subsequently forgiven in 2005. Similarly, from 2005 to 2012, the total amount of copper export earnings was $32 billion, a number that is twice the stock of external debt at the end of 2023. The answer to why the country did not accumulate savings lies in the ownership structure of the mines. From 1960 to 1969, Zambia's copper industry was in the hands of foreign multinationals, and therefore much of the earnings were externalized. As alluded to earlier, the first debt crisis tragically came about as an effort on the part of the country. Okay, so pertaining to the second debt crisis, by 2005, the copper mines had been reprivatized and externalization resumed. Tandika Mkandawire estimated that had Zambia set up a copper-backed sovereign wealth fund between 2002 and 2014, it would have accumulated a total of $20 billion in savings. This would have been enough to avoid borrowing externally altogether. So that's the first factor, external factor, the role of copper. The second factor is the role of the IMF in creating debt. Now let me turn to the role that IMF conditionality on fiscal constraints play on debt. At the start of the 90s, the Zambian economy was undergoing severe economic distress. The economy experienced a recession over 3 consecutive years. Inflation was out of control. Government finances were also in trouble with the government registering budget deficit of 10% or more. At the behest of the IMF, as part of their structural adjustment program, the Zambian government instituted what is called a cash budget policy in 1993, which restricted government expenditure to revenues. This is very crazy. Every time I read it, I think about how crazy it is. Not even at a household level do we restrict our expenditures to cash that's available. We have credit cards. But in 1993, the IMF forced the Zambian government to run a cash budgeting policy for about 10 years. You only spend that which you have in cash in the central banks. The cash budget system ran for over a decade from its institution in 1993. According to Adam and Bevan, cash budgeting had a positive and immediate impact on the budget deficit and inflation, okay. However, the cash budget had a significant negative impact on capital expenditure necessary for long-term economic viability. The impact of the cash budget can be seen on its impact on the evolution of the budget deficit. There. Figure 5 charts the path of Zambia's budget deficit from 1991 to 2023, What is evident in the figure is that during the period of cash budgeting, which lasted from 1993 to the early 2000s, Zambia scored relatively low budget deficits and even recorded a surplus in 95 and 2001. However, as described above, relatively low budget deficits in this period came at the expense of capital expenditure. Because from about 2011, when the cash budget mandate was lifted, so it was lifted in about the late 2000s, large budget deficits became the order of the day as the government tried to catch up with the infrastructure backlog that had resulted from cash budgeting the previous era. So one can look at this graph and say, oh, at some point the Zambian government was well behaved and then it became badly behaved. But actually the story is that at some point the Zambian government's hands were tied. When those constraints were lifted, the government tried to catch up with expenditure. Some evidence of the impact of cash budgeting on expenditure, on infrastructure expenditure, is seen in figure 6 here, which shows the evolution of average class sizes in Zambian primary schools from 1974 to 2017. Starting at an average class size of 48 pupils in 1974, the class size gradually declined to about 38 in the mid-90s as the government built schools and hired teachers. Thereafter, class sizes began to rise sharply, reaching a historically high average of 57 as the government failed to keep up with the growing demands of schooling. In 2010 onwards, average class sizes declined once more as the government responded by building more schools and hiring teachers. It is striking how the patterns in this figure reflect dynamics in the budget deficit that I presented above. So the evidence presented in this section shows that it was not surprising that the country embarked on a borrowing exercise in the 2010s in the hope of gaining some of the ground that had been lost from infrastructure spending in the previous 2 decades. So that's external, the second force, external force, the role of the IMF in generating debt. Let me look at the third force and the final one. And then finally, the role of US monetary policy and debt. There's a long literature on the link between portfolio flows to the rest of the world and the stance of developed country monetary policy, and especially that of the US. It is therefore a logical empirical question to investigate whether developed country monetary policy has any impact on Zambia's external debt acquisition. Figure 7 shows that the relationship between net portfolio flows into Zambia and the federal funds rate over the period to 2005-2022. So it shows net flows into Zambia, net flows of portfolio flows into Zambia, and the US interest rate, the federal funds rate. Net portfolio flows in Zambia, net portfolio flows are defined as external flows into Zambia less portfolio flows out of Zambia. On the other hand, federal funds rate is a benchmark interest rate in the US. Figure 7 shows rather remarkably that periods of relatively low interest rates in the US have been followed by massive portfolio flows into Zambia. Conversely, periods of relatively high interest rates in the US have been followed by low portfolio flows into Zambia, and at times even portfolio outflows. Okay, so to conclude the case study, Zambia, like many countries, is yet again in the midst of another sovereign debt crisis. With the exception of brief periods, since 1964, Zambia has always had high and escalating stocks of external debt that have jeopardized its aspirations for development. In other words, Zambia has always been in a permanent state of debt. This article's main argument is that contrary to the literature that sees sovereign debt crisis as largely internal, the overwhelming forces driving Zambia's debt have been external, specifically copper price dynamics, IMF conditionality on fiscal constraints, and US monetary policy. So what's to be done? In the paper, we talk about some solutions. Obviously, Zambia needs to establish a sovereign wealth fund, right? The problem is we don't own the mines, so how do we own the mines? Do we outrightly nationalize them? Do we take out debt to buy a stake in our own mines? Those are some of the debates that we need to be had in Zambia. The second policy implication of this work is that this analysis has shown that periods of IMF-imposed constraints on fiscal expenditure have led to build-up of debt in subsequent periods. The Zambian government attempts to catch up with infrastructure spending. It is worth noting that at present, and as their preferred way of dealing with the country's debt crisis, the IMF has imposed yet another strict fiscal constraint on the Zambian government that requires, in their own words, a large, front-loaded, and sustained fiscal consolidation over the medium term. It is therefore conceivable that Zambia's debt will increase in the future once the constraint is lifted. Fundamentally, the IMF needs to rethink fiscal austerity as a solution to debt crisis, because not only does it impose huge social costs, but also begets future debt crisis. And then the last force is US monetary policy. So we've got to think about reintroducing capital controls to prevent money coming in and going out pretty easily. So that's sort of concluding the case study, and then I'll very quickly, in the few minutes remaining, talk about the proposals from the Jubilee Report. But the point about this case study is that it's not just a uniquely Zambian phenomena. It is an African phenomena and very largely a global South phenomena, that debt is driven by factors beyond this country's control. And often the mental model we have is that they have done it to themselves. And if we keep thinking that way, these crises will keep on happening. So what proposals are in the Jubilee Report? So this is the cover page of the report, list of commissioners. So the report is really structured into 4 parts. There's a part 1 that does a diagnostic of the current crisis, and the diagnostic of the current crisis is largely the story I told of Zambia. Part 2 talks about principles for resolving debt crisis, which need to articulate new principles for resolving debt crisis. Part 3 is on actions to resolve future crises, actions to resolve the current crisis, and then part 4, how to avoid future crisis. So I'll go very quickly on principles for resolving debt crisis, because the diagnostic is really the Zambian diagnostic. So some of the principles here that we're articulating in this report is country-specific approaches, which when we are trying to resolve a crisis in a country, they should have country-specific approaches, unlike the way the IMF has this one-size-fits-all solution, but buttressed by common principles. So for example, if you want to resolve the crisis in Zambia, you have to understand the role of copper. You have to understand the role of US monetary policy, which might be common to many countries. You also have to understand the role that the IMF has played at particular historical junctures in generating crisis in the future. Another principle is shared responsibility between creditors and debtors. Often the IMF actually enables creditors here. What we've seen, for example, in the Zambian case, is creditors are always quick to blame the errant country, to say you did, it takes 2 to tango, but creditors always want to say the problem is you, it's not me. It's like a breakup. It's a weird way of doing it. And then another principle that we're trying to articulate in the report is no more net transfers out of debt-distressed countries. The point here is that what we tend to see is that this is like a feature of the global financial system. It's very pro-cyclical when it comes to Africa, right? So what happens is that in good times, money flows to Africa. In bad times, when Africa needs the money flows out pretty quickly, and often the IMF enables this kind of behavior. What other principles are we trying to articulate in this report? So when we're trying to restructure debt, make sure that the restructurings include principal reductions. So the principal amount of the debt should be reduced. We want to call for maturity extensions. So really a genuine restructuring of debt has to have an increased maturity, right? So one of the big causes of the current debt crisis is that countries were taking out 10-year Euro bonds, right? And then when we try to restructure that debt, you're given 5 more years to pay it. But what we're calling for is longer maturity horizons. And then a final principle is growth rather than austerity. So the IMF loves austerity, which impacts growth, which makes the debt crisis even worse, right? So what we're actually calling for is that in moments of debt crisis, rather than calling for austerity, you should actually call for expansion in expenditure, which is actually what happens in the global north when they have a recession or they're in trouble. What they do fiscal stimulus. So that's the principles. Actions to resolve the current debt crisis. What can be done? Obviously, extend and expand debt suspension initiatives. South Africa is hosting the G20. I think 2 or 3 years ago, an outcome of, I don't know who was the chair of the G20 in 2020, but whoever it was did something rather interesting. They introduced something called a debt service suspension initiative. So for a couple of years, countries that were heavily indebted didn't pay interest. And it worked miracles. So we're asking that much more of that and expanding it. Obviously, quick policy to change incentives. Often the IMF is always bringing about perverse incentives. So often the IMF comes in to bail out a country, but actually bailing out the creditors. And because they're doing that, the creditors often behave in a very silly way. So we have to control that kind of behavior. What else do we have here? So avoiding future crisis, and this is the last, I think my last slide. Avoiding future crises is we need to improve the quality of lending, quality by quantity, maturity. Why do we need to borrow? I mean, development requires huge capital outlays whose money may not be domestically resourced, so you've got to go out and borrow. But we have to improve the quality of lending. Countries need to borrow at much longer horizons, much big amounts of money and that kind of thing. So we have to address some of the dysfunctions in global financial markets. We have to manage this pro-cyclicality and counter-cyclicality that I talked about earlier. We have to find a way of managing this. When good times the money pours in, the bad times the money leaves. So we need to have capital controls. We need to design better debt contracts. Right now, the way our debt contracts are designed, they're in such a way that heads, the creditors win, tails, the creditors still win. And yet a debt contract is a creditor and a debtor, right? So what we do need are the types of debt contracts where the risk is shared. So there's some very interesting proposals on the table. Prof Chelwa at Yale has proposed GDP indexed bonds. So a bond is issued, it's linked to the economic performance of a country. If the economy is doing well, creditor and debtor are doing well. If the economy is doing badly, both creditor and debtor take a haircut. Or you could have bonds that are tied to copper, for example. If the price of copper collapses, what happens then? The creditor also takes a haircut and so on and so forth. And then we need to create a multilateral framework for resolving the sovereign debt crisis. What's the interesting thing is that we don't as yet have an international bankruptcy court. So we don't have a multilateral system for resolving debt. When a country goes into debt, we don't know what to do. We just have hodgepodge solutions, and in the process, the poor suffer. It took Zambia 5 years from the time it defaulted in 2020 to actually get to some solution. And that solution is actually not satisfactory. It will create another debt crisis. By some of my own calculations, by 2031, we will be back to where we are in Zambia right now. What else are we calling for here? Establish a fund for the repurchase of distressed debt. So for example, when a country is indebted, one of the things that you can do as a country is to buy back your own debt, because often when you're in debt, the interest rate rises, so the face value of the debt collapses. You can easily buy it back and owe it to yourselves, but often you don't have the money to buy it back. So suppose we created a fund that could repurchase distressed debt. And then creating a global climate fund. We know the role that climate does in generating a debt crisis. For example, in Zambia, one external factor I didn't talk about was that in 2015 we had a drought, historic drought. That drought meant that our electricity production immediately collapsed because we generate electricity from hydro. So we took out loans to import emergency power from Mozambique and other places that added onto our debt stock. So we need to think about what we do about climate change and establishing a fund that helps countries that have climate-induced debt. We need to create a global fund to stabilize commodity prices. You know, commodity prices play a big role in external debt, so we might need to think about a multilateral fund to stabilize commodity prices. We need to reform the IMF or World Bank or do away with them, right? Because they're not really doing their job. They're not doing the job that they were ostensibly set up to do in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. You know, often they're protecting the powerful, often they're making things worse in the global south. So we need to do some stuff about IMF and World Bank, and perhaps we need a new global monetary fund. There's some stuff about reform creditor jurisdiction legislation. One of the most strangest things is that international bonds are registered in 2 jurisdictions, New York and London. So when you get into trouble as a country, you can't even resolve that using your own local jurisdiction, right? You'll be sued in New York City or you'll be sued in London. And your guess is as good as mine as to who the judges in London are likely to favor or the judges in New York are likely to favor. And then, multilateral tax cooperation, which is a big deal. So because one of the reasons why we're borrowing is that we're unable to mobilize domestic resources, partly because these multinationals are dodging taxes, right? So we need to figure out ways in which we can cooperate across borders so that multinationals are not hiding taxes. Sorry, I breezed through this, but I hope you found it useful, and I'll be happy at some point to take questions. Thank you so much.
No, thanks very much, Grieve, for giving us a flavor of the Jubilee Report. For those who are interested, if you Google it, you can find it online. It can be downloaded for free. And also for prefacing that with an analysis of the Zambia case. I think Zambia is one of the countries that unfortunately epitomizes some of these problems of debt and development and the way it's crippled the country over time. Yeah, so let me hand over to Kamal, who'll be speaking next, and afterwards we will take a Q&A from both online and in the room.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you, Grieve. It's a long report and it's difficult to summarize, but I think in the most part, the report does very well to identify current challenges, structural challenges, and necessary reforms to the international financial architecture. My report today is going to mostly focus on the G20 common framework itself. The three main points that I'll be making today is that Africa has immense developmental potential with abundant renewable resources and a fast-growing population, but Africa's potential is being threatened, and it's being threatened by this heavy debt burden, which consumes a significant share of revenues and is far exceeding the continent's annual climate financing needs and financing for education and health. And that the G20 common framework has become the center of sovereign debt restructuring and is currently ill-equipped to address Africa's debt crisis, and has in fact discouraged many creditors from debtors from getting relief when they need it. And again, this is in the context in which 85% of the Sustainable Development Goals are off track, stagnating, or regressing. And these debt burdens that Grieve described make it impossible to meet these future investment needs, right? 57% of Africa's population, or 751 million people, are living in countries that allocate more funds to servicing external debt than on education and health. And I think the paper that Grieve presented on Zambia explains quite well that debt distress is systemic, right? It's driven by external macroeconomic, geopolitical, and climate shocks. And of course, there are many things that sovereigns can do, like having soft targets on how much external debt they have relative to internal debt, capital control mechanisms or capital flow mechanisms, sovereign wealth funds, and a range of other internal policies. But there is a huge amount of external pressure. For example, the tightening financial conditions, commodity dependence, capital flight, currency depreciation, all of these things that have kind of been imposed externally, including the move by leading central banks of Europe and the US, especially the US Federal Reserve, to raise interest rates, which has made it harder for African nations to access affordable and sustainable finance, which ultimately undermines growth. And importantly, another structural problem is the G20 common framework itself. So last week there was a meeting. Last week there was a meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors that ended on Friday, and there was a communique, right, that came out of this. And a communique is just, the expression of what all of these countries think that they can say together as the lowest common denominator, right? Despite the various conflicts and contentions and contradictions between the countries. And essentially, they noted that there's a global debt challenge, but put it down to mostly being a liquidity challenge for many countries, and kind of the progress that they put forward is they have kind of committed to reforming the G20 common framework, and they've reviewed its progress, but agreed on little to reform it. So let's take a step back quickly to look at why the G20 has become the premier forum for sovereign debt restructuring, right? So if 50 years ago, if you were a sovereign, if you were Zambia, right, and you defaulted on your debt, you would go to what's called the Paris Club, which is a club of creditors, governments of the OECD countries. So it's your rich Western nations. And that's where you would kind of go to restructure your debt, right? Zambia would go to the Paris Club, say, hey guys, I'm going to default. They would say, okay, go to the IMF, get an IMF program, and then come back to us when you have an IMF program, and we will discuss how much of your debt we think is appropriate to kind of restructure. And so what we've seen since 2020 is a new forum. Countries no longer go to the Paris Club, they now go to the G20. Right? And they go to the G20 common framework for these restructurings on a case-by-case basis. And the reason for this is in this graph, right? It's because the share of total debt owed to just the Paris Club has shrunk dramatically. And it's shrunk not just in relative terms, going from 28% in 2008 to 6% in 2023, but also in absolute terms. In 2008, African debt owed to the Paris Club was 57 billion, and in 2023 it was 48 billion. While, on the other hand, debt to other sovereigns like China has doubled in relative terms, and is now about 8% of the total debt stock owed to bilateral creditors from Africa. And in absolute terms, it's increased from 7 billion to 62 billion, right? Proportionally, the amount owed to your World Bank and your African Development Bank has kind of remained the same, similarly for other development banks. But another huge increase in borrowing by African countries has been borrowing from private capital markets by issuing bonds. And this borrowing has doubled, right? And has gone from 25 billion in 2008 to about 186 billion. And one of the main reasons why this is so relevant is because and I think we'll get to it a bit later, but one of the reasons why this is so relevant is because this borrowing is very expensive, right? It's less concessional than what your bilateral lending would be. And I mean, if you look at the average sovereign bond yields, or the interest rate that is charged, or the interest rate at which these bonds are issued, for Africa, the average is around 9.8% on average between 2020 and 2024. In Germany, it's 0.8%. In the US, 2.5%. So this is an incredibly expensive debt to a region of the world that needs cheap debt for its development needs the most. And not only is it expensive, but public debt interest payments as a share of government revenue has increased in Africa faster than any other region in the world, by 10% between 2010 and 2023, while in other regions it's increased by 4% in Latin America, 1% in Asia, and 1.1% in Europe and Central Asia. And of course, the outcome of this is a weakened ability to issue new debt or refinance existing obligations at affordable rates. These interest payments are consuming Africa's fiscal space, and as was mentioned by Grieve, this is meaning that 14 African countries are currently in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. Further, this graph kind of shows how African countries with the highest share of government revenues are consumed by interest payments in 2024, and many are above thresholds that are considered sustainable. And what this has led to ultimately is a choice, right? It's a choice that African countries are making when the restructuring system of the G20 Common Framework is failing. They have to choose between either not to default on debt, but rather to default on development. And so many African countries are choosing to decrease spending on education, health, and consolidate fiscally instead of restructuring, which is the point at which many are at. And you know, debt is kind of like this. It's neither good nor bad. If you use it constructively for developmental spending to expand the productive capabilities of your economy, it can be a good thing. It's kind of this conversation with the future, and it can be a positive conversation or a negative one. But currently, you have to either choose between not having a conversation with the future at all, or imposing serious kind of constraints on yourself. So I think this has already been mentioned around, you know, spending on education is now lower than interest payments, and similarly, health spending is lower for many countries than interest payments. On average, debt service will account for 137% of Africa's climate financing needs. So this is kind of that conversation with the future around being able to finance your transition is also a conversation that is being blocked off. I'll skip through this, but so coming back to the G20, right? They are, you know, while debt renegotiations are not new, the current creditor composition and the political economy surrounding these negotiations are quite new, right? And the G20's key response was first the debt service suspension initiative mentioned by Grieve, and then the G20 common framework, both established in 2020. However, both of them have fallen short in a number of ways. Firstly, the DSSI was launched in May 2020, and it aimed to suspend the debt service payments of poor countries until December of 2021, which was kind of aimed at allowing countries to redirect their spending towards kind of COVID responses. The DSSI was designed to be net present value neutral, which meant that after the suspension, the total value of future payments adjusted for time would kind of stay the same. And so there would be no reduction in the actual capital or what a country would pay over the entire life cycle of that debt. As a result, $12.9 billion US worth of debt was suspended across 48 countries. However, 73 countries were eligible. Some of the problems with the DSSI was that it excluded multilateral development banks and private creditors, both of whom we saw earlier. Private creditors make up a huge amount of sovereign debt obligations in Africa. And so the fact that they excluded meant that there was limited restructuring to get countries to a point at which they were on a sound fiscal basis. And there was also some concerns amongst debtors about the kind of potential unintended consequences of these kind of short-term ramifications of credit downgrades. And so there were many countries, as I mentioned, 25 countries, for example, who applied or who were eligible for this debt restructuring but didn't take it. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, why would you not take a program that you apply for? And the reason is because many countries were scared of the stigma and being locked out of accessing private capital markets and being locked out of accessing and issuing bonds. And then the concern with the DSSI was that there's this unequal participation of creditors. So, for example, while China had just 30% of total bilateral claims, it suspended 63% of total eligible payments. And while MDBs, multilateral development banks, with 18% of the total claims, rescheduled only 1% during negotiations, and only one private creditor rescheduled, and pretty much relatively there was zero restructuring or suspension from private creditors. So following the DSSI, there were still repayment pressures that increased once again. And so what was established was the G20 common framework, which included Saudi Arabia and included China. It continued to be a case-by-case approach, and only 4 countries used the the common framework, including Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia, which is a case study Grieve spoke through, and Ghana. The common framework is this kind of mechanism, right, that has unfortunately created this kind of vicious cycle, right? The shortcomings of the common framework has prevented countries from receiving timely and necessarily debt relief. And while sovereign debt risks are still very high, the kind of sustained investment that's needed for sustainable development on health, education, infrastructure, and green transitions has declined. So we kind of, along with some co-authors at Boston University, including Marina Zucker-Marquez, Ricardo Dorso, Kevin Gallagher, and former central banker Patrick Njoroge, we looked at what are the main flaws of the G20 common framework, being that it's too slow, it doesn't offer enough debt relief, it fails to ensure private creditor participation, it doesn't have an enforceable comparability of treatment, and it doesn't link debt relief to development, including the exclusion of middle-income countries that should apply. And we came up with a number of proposals that we think would be useful to overcome these challenges of the common framework. And I'll go through them quite quickly, but maybe just speak about the most exciting ones. The first proposal would be an automatic debt service standstill for 2 years. So if a country applies for to the common framework because they're in debt distress or they need to default, there would be a 2-year suspension on any debt services, on any interest rate. And what this would do is it would encourage private creditors to come to the table very quickly, because they would be incentivized, because in the meantime, while the restructuring is happening, they're not earning any interest. And so that would incentivize them to come to the table. And it would also incentivize debtors to kind of pursue the debt relief without bearing the entire burden of interest payments until there's a resolution. The other thing that it would do is it would create clarity between whether there's a liquidity issue or a solvency issue, right? A lot of the countries that have been in debt distress have been saying this is a solvency issue, while the IMF has been saying, no, this is a liquidity issue. I think it's become quite clear if a country has a liquidity issue for 4 years, I'm not sure if it's still a liquidity issue, but having that debt service standstill allows more clarity on that. And on that, I think for this proposal, there must be some caution as well, and this would require the private sector agreement. So bondholders would need to agree to this, which is very difficult given what Grieve mentioned earlier, that the places in which these bonds are issued and the jurisdictions that govern this debt, the private creditor debt, is mostly in London and in New York. So there would either need to be something like legislative reform in those cities and in those countries, or something like a UN convention on debt that would be a treaty-based and would therefore need to apply to all countries. The second incentive that is important here is transparency. And transparency is something that would kind of incentivize cooperation. This includes transparency of a debt sustainability analysis, because it would become very clear exactly what relief a country needs. Instead, it's kind of jostled about in these restructurings, and often what countries get in relief is less than what they need. And therefore, you have this repetitive cycle of, I haven't gotten enough relief, and so I end up going back for restructurings again and again, and continuing these programs with the IMF. But if you have a transparent debt sustainability analysis, you know exactly how much needs to be cut, and you cut that amount, and it allows countries the space to grow again and grow out of their debt burden. And then the last proposal here would be a kind of group-based approach. So this approach would mean that instead of countries going one by one to get restructurings, we do a debt sustainability analysis on all countries, and all countries who need it would apply. And what this would do is it would take away the stigma of being locked out of capital markets, and allow countries to apply for the relief when they need it. Another kind of proposal we have is to reform the debt sustainability analysis itself, as well as to create a fair comparability of treatment rule about how much each creditor should get cut in the debt stock, or in the rescheduling, or in the reprofiling. And then, there's a few, two of our last proposals are about expanding those countries who are eligible for the common framework to include middle-income countries, and designing a country-owned growth-enhancing investment plan so that countries aren't stuck in this constant debt trap. I would have liked to speak a little bit about financing for development and the common framework, which kind of includes a number of the proposals that we have made as well, and discuss some critiques of the FFD process itself. But I think I'm kind of out of time, so I will thank you there, and I'm really grateful for everyone who has come out today, and very honored to be on a platform with my friend Grieve. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kamal. And if anyone wants to ask Kamal about the FFD proposals, which he couldn't get to. I'm sure he'll be happy to speak to those. Okay. Got it. Thanks. I think these two presentations have really complemented each other well in dealing with issues of debt, development, underdevelopment. These debates are also really relevant to South Africa. Current macroeconomic and broader economic policy debates. Often, I think, in our discussions around macro policy in South Africa, South Africa's debt is used by mainstream economists and policymakers as an argument for fiscal austerity. The argument being that we've got so much debt, it's squeezing our economic and our health and education expenditure. Therefore, we need to spend less so we can pay that debt back. And although there's a common recognition, I think, of the problems of debt, it leads to different policy implications depending on our political and political economy perspectives. As Kamal pointed out, it depends a lot on what debt is used for. If you borrow to spend productively, and productive not only being infrastructure like bridges and roads, but in health and education and social development and so on, then that's not necessarily a problem, because if you're growing, you can pay it back, and you're investing in the future of human beings, unlike if the money is being wasted. Yeah, but perhaps when you're commenting on, or when you're responding to questions, you might also want to pick up on that, because I think it's often a tension or a point of difference in our economic policy debates in South Africa. So maybe you can also comment on that. But let's open for any questions or comments. For those who are online, you can either type your comment out or you can indicate that you would like to speak. But let's start with those in the room. Anyone? Yeah, Kiru, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of you for your wonderful presentations. I'll be very brief. My name is Kiru, I'm at UJ. In the case of Zambia, if you look at 2020 during the COVID period, Zambia was the first country to default on its sovereign debt, as in first African country. And then remarkably, in 2023, it was also the first country to be able to structure its debt under the G20 framework. Now, the question that I wanted you to address is the issue of governance and corruption. In the case of Zambia, how does it influence, or how has it influenced the debt accumulation as well as underdevelopment? Because in 2020, you had a different regime, given that it's a democracy in the country. And then again in 2023, there was another regime, which is still the current one. Thank you so much.
Kiru is one of our postdocs who, as you might have picked up, is from Zambia. Oh, of course, it feels you're in charge. Yeah. Okay, Sandile.
Hi guys, my name is Sandile. Thank you both for your wonderful presentation. My question is specifically to Grieve, right? On the question of at least maybe flight, capital, which you touched on a bit, that majority of the flight capital that takes place in Africa does not come from productive sectors like the manufacturing sector and stuff. It comes directly from the extractive sectors, and this extractive, it's possible for them to extract and fly this capital. Precisely, these are not African companies that are sort of extracting from African economies, right? I mean, as part of the solution, right? I mean, as soon as you speak about the external, effectively we are sort of departing from mainstream economics, right? Which suggests that, the state is inherently inefficient, the private sector is, is efficient and stuff. Is not, sort of nationalizing, these resources within the African continent, a resolution to flight capital and, resource mobilization. So even in the context of like, I asked this question last week, so I'll sort of give an answer, to the possible answer that, can't we, even if we create sovereign wealth funds, it's a waste of time if we don't own these, these natural resources. And the argument would be that, well, everywhere the African governments touch, it becomes a mess. It's going to be the same thing in our, in our commodity sectors. But that issue can be solved by building institutions. It's an institutional framework can simply there. So as part of, dealing with this question of debt, shouldn't we mobilize, collectively in Africa, radically, that, we must sort of nationalize these resources and create sovereign wealth funds? Thank you.
Thanks, Grieve and Kamal, for the wonderful presentation. This is Petani speaking. I've enjoyed both the presentations, and I have read some of the Jubilee Report and the report you did with the Tricontinental Institute. And at the base of it, what I get is that the IMF is a highly undemocratic and probably very unethical institute that when you borrow from them, of course, you're going to keep going and going back to them. And as we saw with the uprisings in Nairobi in 2023 with the finance bill and how they impose the fiscal policies of countries that borrow from them in the global south. I mean, even Burkina Faso is, with all its radical posture, still has to go to the IMF and look for money. So I think for me, the question that I'm trying to pose is that with all these crises that we have seen, I mean, Zambia was the first to default during COVID. We had the Kenyan uprisings, and even South Africa recently, we just went back to get some loans. So what kind of political outlook can be a solution for not only for Africa, but generally for global South countries? Because as we know, it's not only us in Africa, but also in South America and also Southeast Asia, where many of these countries are suffering from this neoliberalization of the economies from the West. So what could be the possible response, given the fact that we have to go back to the IMF to try and borrow, but at the same time we are dealing with people who are unprincipled and trying to keep us at the bottom forever? Thanks.
Okay, let's take those 3 questions and then another round.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed Kamal's presentation, and common framework has caused nightmares in Zambia. I think every common man and woman on the street knows about the common framework and just how nightmarish it has been. So I'm glad you talked about it. The question about governance and corruption is an interesting one. I think when one does an audit of what most African governments have done with the money that they borrowed, right? Obviously there's theft, there's pilferage. It is there in Zambia, it is there in the US, Enron, Arthur Andersen, financial crisis, it is there everywhere. But in my estimation, I think the Zambian government did a lot with very little, right? If you look at essentially what they did with the money they borrowed, it will take us some way, new power stations, new highways, new hospitals, health centers, water reticulation, all these kinds of things. Unfortunately, the payoff from these types of infrastructure outlays comes very much down the line, which is a problem with the way these debt contracts are structured, right? We're borrowing for 10 years to put up a highway or a hydroelectric dam. In the US, they have the expression shovel-ready projects, right? It takes you a while. Even if you borrow to build up a power station, you borrow for 10 years, you probably start building that power station in the 5th year. 5 years, the loan is due and you're defaulted. So there is mismanagement, there is corruption, but I think it's a red herring. It is a red herring. Even if we got you, Kiru, today, who's an incredibly ethical guy, we put you in the Ministry of Finance in Zambia as our Minister of Finance, and we don't resolve the global structural factors, we'll be back in a debt crisis in 2031. And then the argument will be, oh, Kiru must have stolen, right? So I think this is how I look at it. These African governments are doing a lot with very little, to be honest. I mean, if you look at how much they collect in taxes, very little. the kind of debt contracts that they have to engage in, very little. But there is theft, there's pilferage, and we have to be alert as citizenry, and we have to hold them to account. But if we want to try to fix this issue, it's much bigger than just that. Nationalizing, I like to nationalize. We should do it. I'll tell you a story about nationalizing. So when Zambia nationalized the mines in 1970, actually strictly we didn't nationalize. We actually bought out Anglo-American and American Metal Climax, who were the entities who had owned these mines. God knows how they came to own them, right? But when we bought them out in 1970, we called it nationalizing. It wasn't. We bought them out, we issued bonds to pay them off, and then subsequently that created the first debt crisis in Zambia. How tragic. We created a debt crisis by trying to get our resources back. So Kenneth Kaunda was president at the time. He had wanted to do it Chile style because Chile has copper. And Allende, Salvador Allende, nationalized, literally took them over. No compensation. And then you see what happened to Allende, right? Kaunda saw that, panicked. So instead, he issued bonds. So, okay, I'm going to be a gentleman. I'll issue bonds, but then that caused the first debt crisis. So I'm with you. The solution is nationalization. Look at what copper has done for Chile, right? It's actually very strange, interesting that in the neoliberal era of Augusto Pinochet, not even he, as neoliberal and as evil as he was, did not privatize the Chilean copper industry. He still kept it state-owned, and it continues to be state-owned even today. And that's powered social and economic transformation in Chile. But I think we have to do it smartly. That's the problem. If Zambia does it alone, our president will be dead. I mean, the current one doesn't have the marbles to do it, the guts to do it. But if we get Kiru there, right? You know, I would worry for him. So how do you do it? Like, I think what you're alluding to is how do we collectively devise a strategy where we collectively nationalize, right? Going back to what Sankara said in 1987 in Addis when he said, if I refuse to pay the debt on my own, I won't be here next time. If we do it together, we have a chance. I think I guess that's the challenge to us, right? Our generation. What are the clever theoretical strategies? How do we build a theory of nationalization continental-wide? I guess that's the challenge. The last question was on from Comrade Fatani there about, how do we move from here to there? I think this idea of South-South cooperation is a deep one. Why does Zambia need to borrow in US dollars in the first place? Because it needs to import, right? And the global reserve currency somehow structured in the post-World War II moment is the US dollar, right? But I think there's some clever, Lula, when he was running for office in Brazil, he proposed a regional currency in South America. How do we, because at the end of the day, the reason why we want US dollars is to trade. Is there ways we can trade that bypasses the US dollar? Currency swaps, direct swaps, those kinds of things. More South-South cooperation. One of the most striking things I found out working with this commission, the Jubilee Commission, is that you have a very interesting situation in Africa. There are some central banks in Africa that are highly liquid. They're sitting on lots of liquidity. And then there are some central banks that have nothing. Why isn't there like cross-central bank lending? You know, the Bank of Botswana, for example, is sitting on lots of reserves. You know, the Bank of Zambia is sitting on nothing. You know, the bank of somewhere else might be sitting on a lot of reserves. So, but we are all parking our reserves in US treasuries, right? So it's bizarre. And I think, yeah, so resolving these mental problems, mental type of very strange type of affliction, right? Where we have this belief in the US dollar. I think I don't know, yeah, that's Kamal.
Thank you so much, Grieve. So, Q, your question around the role of corruption, I think it's very important, right? And one of the ways that you deal with that is by having checks and balances, right, on power and on those who are borrowing, right, and on those who are lending, because there's many cases, Mozambique, for example, with the tuna bond crisis, where lenders lend irresponsibly, right? So you need a common set of principles for both borrowers to borrow responsibly and lenders to lend responsibly, right? And establishing a set of international principles on responsible borrowing and lending would set the basis for a kind of pushing back against that corruption. The other thing that's worth noting is that there are things that we can do nationally in our national legislation to prevent irresponsible borrowing of our governments, right? As citizens, as academics, as civil society, as political parties, we should be aiming to advance legislative reform that ensures that there's more parliamentary oversight on foreign borrowing. And this isn't something that's new, right? It exists in many countries, and a lot of global south countries only implement this kind of legislation after there's a crisis. So in Mozambique, after the tuna bond crisis, they have now a law that says that foreign debt needs to be approved by parliament, right? In Argentina, recently, after the last IMF program and after the restructuring led by Argentinian former finance minister Martin Guzman, he pushed for a bill that basically says that borrowing from the IMF needs parliamentary approval. And that's one of the checks and balances that you can have to ensure that people see what is being borrowed, ensure that, okay, if this is dollar debt, surely we must be earning dollars from whatever investment it brings about so that we don't have pressure, currency pressure on repayment, ensuring that it aligns with the national developmental goals and not projects, special projects of this minister or that president. So that parliamentary oversight, I think, is an important step. And I hope that in South Africa and in other countries that we push towards getting this kind of legislation soon, because currently we don't have it. And then the other level of corruption that has to be dealt with is illicit financial flows, right? $89 billion every year is lost because of international illicit financial flows. And you cannot put that simply down to African governments. You need someone facilitating the illicit financial flows here locally and abroad to wherever they're going. So this is it's an international problem, right? And it requires an international solution. The question by Petani is a good one. What are we going to do about the IMF? You know, it's a problem we've had for many years, and there's a camp that says, okay, we need to reform the IMF, and part of that reformation is looking at the fact that the US has a veto power, right? So, for example, one of the things that we're stuck with is the fact that, you know, the IMF, for example, has huge gold reserves, right? That they could sell, if they sold 4% of the gold reserves currently, there would be enough to undertake a HIPC 2, right? Another HIPC, a HIPC-like initiative, right? But in order to sell gold in the IMF, you need to get approval by the US Congress, right? Twice, okay? And is that going to happen? No. So there's resources to solve the debt crisis, but the governance and the nature of governance of the IMF is that it's got a veto power of the US, right? And so those who are arguing for reform think that you can still maneuver within that context, and they think, okay, maybe if we deal with the veto, then it's one step towards having a more democratic IMF. But ultimately, if you want to have an internationalist project and if you want to have a globalized economy, you need an institution like the IMF, right? You need an institution that can offer liquidity in times of global crises, right? And whether you agree with the conditionalities of the IMF or not is you know, it's, even if you wanted to lead a global socialist program, right, which I know you do, you would need to have a global institution like the IMF. You need to recreate it, right? So these institutions play a role in a globalized economy of relieving balance of payments constraints that is important. And then there's another view, of course, which is that we need to build alternatives, right? And there is some mumbling and murmuring about this kind of program. The BRICS countries have proposed something that they call a contingent reserve arrangement, which is aiming to do a similar thing to the IMF, which is to provide liquidity in times of crises. And the idea behind that is to build an alternative so that there's less reliance on the IMF, although I'm not quite convinced that this is really an alternative. Often the programs require IMF programs to be taken on in the first place, and it hasn't kind of been functional yet. They say that it's in its 6th test. even though it has been capitalized. So there is some discussion about building alternatives, but it's still yet to be seen if that is just talk and whether it will be walk as well. And then there's one other thing that Grieve mentioned, which is about what are some of the strategies that we can think about. And I think one of the strategies that's worth considering is a debtors club, right? So you've got the private creditors coordinate themselves in something called the London Club, right? And then the bilateral lenders historically have, the OECD countries organize themselves in the Paris Club, right? And so when you have defaulted, you go to these clubs, as a single country, and you are faced with all of your creditors, right? And of course, you'll never get the best deal, right? It's like going as one worker to renegotiate your salary. You're way less likely to get a good outcome than if you unionize, right? And renegotiate your salary or your wage collectively. And I think that a debtors club where debtors organize themselves, and when there is a large-scale external crisis like a pandemic, they would be able to go to the kind of creditors, to the G20 Common Framework, to the London Club, and renegotiate it in a group. And why that's relevant is because if I owe Grieve 1,000 rand, that's my problem, right? It's my problem if I owe him 1,000 rand. I must avoid him when I see him in the elevator. I must be like, I owe this guy 1,000 rand. If I owe Grieve 10 million rand, that is his problem. Because that's a lot of money and he needs that to be repaid, right? And then I have the power in that case.
Recording in progress.
And so it's important to think about setting up things like debtor clubs, centered around resources, centered around things like critical minerals, centered around countries who have high external debt servicing exposure. Thank you.
No, thanks. Let's take one more quick round of questions and we'll aim to wrap up in the next 5-10 minutes. Let's start with a question online from Philippe. Please go ahead. Are we able to connect Philippe? Okay, let's take Freeman in the meantime.
Thank you, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. My question to you is, you mentioned the issue of corruption and pilferage. So in your mind, what does this portray with regards to Zambia's judiciary and legal system? Is this system efficient, strong, to complement the efforts being done from a macroeconomic perspective, or it is weak and indirectly supporting debt sustainability challenges in Zambia? Thank you.
I think that they're just struggling. Can you just restate the question in a sentence?
Given that you mentioned corruption issues in Zambia, so what comes to your mind with regards to Zambia's legal and judiciary system? Does it support the macroeconomic objectives being done, or it is indirectly supporting debt sustainability challenges in Zambia? Thank you.
Let's try Philippe again. Okay. Philippe, if you're there, you can type your question and someone will read it out. Any other questions before we bring? Yeah, right over here.
Afternoon, everyone. I wanted to ask, why is it that African countries, why can't we use our natural resources as leverage to negotiate with the IMF and the World Bank to restructure our debt? Because it seems like the global north needs our resources to function. So why can't we use that as power for us to, negotiate better deals when we ask for loans? Thank you.
The last question over there.
Afternoon, everyone. My question is actually me agreeing with Sandile and the panelists on the issue of nationalizing natural resources. But then the question becomes then, once we've nationalized these resources, how do we then ensure accountability and tracked performance? Because if we can check a neighboring country like Zimbabwe, they follow that route of nationalizing their resources, but then if we check the current economy of Zimbabwe, it's not doing very well. So how do we, and I think it's partly because of there was no tracked performance and accountability. Then if we know that currently we are faced with a serious issue of political accountability and corruption, how do we then, once we have nationalized these resources, because I do believe that it's these resources that can help us deal with debt and ensure development. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start and then I'll give the difficult ones to Kamal. So the question from Zambia about corruption and the judiciary, and I think it's a general question about oversight mechanisms in trying to check corruption and try to prevent it and try to convict those who've been found to be corrupt. So it's true that we could do a whole lot better in Zambia, and I think in most African countries, in bringing, I think that was Kamal's point, bringing up legislation that entrenches oversight, checks and balances, parliamentary oversight, the people's oversight. People who are found wanting should go to court, or people who are accused should go to court. Experience due process. If they are convicted, go serve the time or whatever. I think we can do a whole lot in that regard. But my main argument is that that won't cure the problem we're trying to solve, right? And I think there's been, one of the things that corruption has been used a lot as a red herring in the literature on African development, good governance, all this kinds of stuff, capacity building, strengthening institutions, so on and so forth. All that stuff is important, but it won't take us to the promised land, right? So I think that's the type of thing that I'm trying to say here, that at least as it comes to debt and as it comes to most things Africa-related, the causes are external, right? But there are things we should do internally, but those things won't take us to the promised land on their own. I think that's, at least that's a lesson I draw from African political economy, On the question of nationalization and accountability, I think one of the most understudied topics, Professor Tregena asked me to speak to some sort of PhD students on Wednesday and postdocs. One of the most understudied topics is the history of management under nationalized regimes in Africa. For example, I have studied what happened in the 30 years following the nationalization of copper in Zambia very closely. When Zambia established what was called the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, a huge conglomerate to run the copper industry and so on and so forth. Like huge social and economic transformation followed. A lot of the engineers and accountants and mining experts who are now working in Zambia's foreign-owned private sector were birthed out of the era of nationalization. There's a very interesting story. In 1966, just 2 years after independence, when the mines are foreign, privately owned by Anglo-American and American Metal Climax, President Kaunda takes a tour to one of the mines, right? And he finds that, okay, the people who just got independence are not present in any of the highest echelons of the management of these privately owned mines. And he asks a question. He says, when do you think the people who just got independence will be able to run these mines, be managers, be executives, and so on and so forth? The executive from American Metal Climax, a New Yorker, with a straight face looks at Kenneth Kaunda and he says, most likely by 2021. This is 1966. And this is essentially what private sector does, right? They justify this kind of BS. Imagine, tells the president, by 2001 is when we can expect, sort of an indigenous person to be running these mines. But after nationalization in 1970, after 5 years, the Zambians were all over the place running the mines at the highest levels of management, went on to have distinguished careers in mining across the world. So one of the things that we haven't done very well is try to do deep case studies of episodes of nationalization in Africa and try to figure out what actually happened. what worked, what didn't work. I think if we did that kind of careful analysis, I think we would not easily conclude that nationalization always means waste, always means inefficiencies, always means wasted opportunities, and so on and so forth. At least in the case of Zambia, consolidated copper mines, by the way, from the time we nationalized the mine in 1970 up until 1999, copper prices declined year on year for 30 years. But still, under those very difficult circumstances, ZCCM did miracles across the country, did miracles for its financial books and so on and so forth. So I think that's the challenge. We haven't studied nationalization, and we're falling very easily, we're falling into the trap of mainstream economics that state-owned is bad, always is bad, no exceptions. But I think it's much more nuanced, and we need careful people to study this kind of episodes. You want to take the leverage natural resources question?
Sorry, my brother. What's your name? Bongani. It's a really good question, Bongani. Thanks for asking it. And if I don't do service to this explanation, there's a report that we developed on this topic, looking at the connection between a debtors coalition, natural resources, and ensuring that countries have sovereignty over energy, food, and technology as the basis for long-term debt sustainability, right, in the continent and in the global south in general, right? Because if you look at a lot of the countries that faced the most severe distress or external debt distress, a lot of those countries, for example, Egypt faced huge distress as a result of reliance on grains from Ukraine. So when that crisis happened, it really punished them. Sri Lanka, for example, imports most of their fuel. And so when there were a number of global shocks, including COVID-19, supply chain risks elevated, there's a range of external shocks that hit the country. The price of fuel and the cost of importing it shot up, and this put huge pressure on their debt situation. Because ultimately, to buy that stuff, you need the currency of the country that's selling it, or US dollars, right? And if you're not exporting enough to meet that currency need, you either have to borrow, or if you're lucky, you've been investing in those foreign countries and those foreign assets for a long time, in which case it's also a bit contradictory, because in order to be sustainable, you need to invest in the productive capabilities of another country instead of your own, right? And so one of the main arguments in this report is around the fact that if you don't have sovereignty, if you're not making your own energy, if you're not making your own food, if you're not able to produce your own medicines because of, I don't know, intellectual property restraints or the high cost of that, if you're importing that because you can't produce it locally, then you will continuously find yourself in having pressure on your balance of payments. Yeah, and then just to end, to say a huge thank you again to Grieve and Fiona, and to everyone who's come out today. We really appreciate the discussion. It's been great. Thank you.
No, thank you to both of the speakers. If you're interested in hearing more, both of the reports which they spoke to are available online. You can also engage with them after this event. Kamal has also brought along hard copies of some other reports, including that one. So that report and some others that the IEJ has worked on, they're on that table over there. You can help yourself afterwards. Just to mention some upcoming events. So Grieve is actually here in South Africa to launch a book on Wednesday. The book is on Thursday, sorry, right. On Thursday, the book is provocatively titled, Can Africans Do Economics? So if you want to know the answer to that, come to the event on Thursday. Grieve is the editor of the book and the author of one of the chapters. Is a really exciting lineup of chapters published by a wonderful publisher, Nkani Books. The event is going to be at the Forge which is a really cool venue in Braamfontein in Decote Street at 6 p.m. on Wednesday. You can search it online, on Thursday, sorry, on Thursday. You can search online or ask Grieve for more information. And then on Wednesday, and this one is actually on Wednesday, Grieve will be running a workshop that we're hosting. It's a training and capacity building workshop aimed primarily at our postdocs and postgraduate students, but everybody is welcome. The training is free from 10 to 12 in the morning at JBS, Johannesburg Business School, and it's on theory and method in the political economy of Africa's development. So that is on Wednesday. Let me also just advertise a couple of other upcoming events in the next week or so. Next Wednesday and Thursday is an event that we are partnering in the TIPS Annual Forum. It's an annual conference on different things linked with industrialization. This year's conference is on the impact of the AfCFTA on industrial development in Southern Africa. It's free to attend. You can just register online, and we will be providing transport from UJ and back both of the days. If you're interested in getting transport, Katlego, can you just identify yourself? You can speak to Katlego there in the cream-colored jacket afterwards. And then next Friday, we are having an online webinar presented by Dr. Ilan Strauss, also one of our visiting associate professors, on the topic, who will police generative AI? Yeah, then we've got a bunch of other events coming up. There's also the WIFA Festival in September, which many of you are aware of. Just keep a lookout on social media for the other announcements. Yeah, so thanks everybody, both those online and those in the room for joining us this afternoon. Please help yourself to some refreshments afterwards, and let's continue to engage and discuss these important issues. Thanks.